Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I'll be speaking with Lance Baldo, CEO of Beacon Therapeutics, a clinical stage biotechnology company harnessing the transformative power of gene therapy to deliver meaningful outcomes for severe ocular diseases. Welcome, Lance.
Thank you for having me, Nicole.
Now, today we'll be exploring the landscape of unmet need in blinding ocular diseases during today's conversation. But I was wondering, Lance, if you would first of all introduce yourself a little bit for listeners and describe the journey that has led you to doing what you do today.
When I joined as the CEO of Beacon about 18 months ago, and by background, I'm a physician scientist, and I've been really privileged to work across many different therapy areas, everything from oncology, cardiovascular, metabolic. The most formative part of my career, where perhaps I felt like I was having the most impact, was when I worked within blindness, within retina. I was at Genentech, and I ran the ophthalmology franchise there for a number of years. And so when I had the opportunity to join Beacon and help the company advance its pipeline, I really jumped at that opportunity, and it's been a really great journey so far.
Thank you, Lance. So let's turn to our discussion today. Blinding ocular diseases are a significant concern globally. Millions of people are affected by conditions that can lead to blindness. Indeed, according to the World Health Organization, the leading causes of vision impairment and indeed blindness include cataracts, refractive errors, age-related macular degeneration or AMD, glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy, and presbyopia. But in particular, Beacon is targeting X-linked retinitis pigmentosa, or XLRP, and geographic atrophy, with its lead program, Laruzova, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in a pivotal clinical trial for XLRP, with results anticipated later this year. So, Lance, I was wondering if you could first of all describe the landscape of unmet need in X-linked retinitis pigmentosa for us.
Yes, perhaps, Nicole, I could start by describing where, and since you've already defined the term, I'll stick to the acronym XLRP. I will define where XLRP kind of fits within the disease spectrum. So there's a fairly large class of diseases called the retinitis pigmentosa. And these are generally inherited retinal diseases that affect the back of the eye, therefore retinitis pigmentosa, and they cause generally progressive blindness. Within that, one of the larger categories is X-linked retinitis pigmentosa. And as you would expect by the name X-linked, it is something that's attached to the X chromosome. And therefore, it's more common, particularly the manifestations, in males versus females, because men only have one X chromosome, whereas females will have two. And so it's a disease that's predominantly, but not exclusively, affects males. And unfortunately, this type of retinitis pigmentosa tends to start impacting patients, often young boys, quite early in life. And so when they're teenagers or even earlier, they start describing trouble seeing at night. They start bumping into objects. By the time they're in their 20s, they may have difficulty reading and driving. By the time they're in their 30s and even into their 40s, they have a hard time kind of holding down general activities of daily living, jobs, and really about half the time that they're in their mid 40s, they're going to be legally blind. And so this is a very devastating condition. And I know, Nicole, around our industry, the term unmet medical need gets thrown around a lot. In fact, it's always been a bit of a bugaboo for me because I think sometimes it gets used a little bit too loosely. In this case, there's absolutely nothing that can be done for these patients. And so the unmet need is absolutely tremendous. And to have a condition that just slowly, progressively makes you go blind is absolutely, devastating, and not just for the patients, but for the people around them, their loved ones, their families, their partners, etc. And so we're just really enthusiastic about how, Laruzova is going to help hopefully advance the care for these patients where there's such dire unmet need.
Thank you, Lance. As you said, devastating indeed, massive life impact. So, Lance, tell us, how does it work? What is it hoped that Laruzova is exactly, if I may use that word, going to offer XLRP patients?
No, for sure. So within this condition, there's a mutation in a particular gene called RPGR. And the protein that's coded by this gene is localized to the photoreceptors in the back of the eye. So these are the cells that allow for light to be transduced and therefore send a signal to the brain, and therefore allow patients to be able to see, of course. So in the case of this disease and of the therapy, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a replacement for that protein into the back of the eye. And so this medicine is delivered subretinally, and as you point out, it is a gene therapy. And what it then does is allows those cells, those photoreceptors, to start producing that RPGR protein. It then localizes to those photoreceptors. There's a particular area called the connecting cilia, and it allows those photoreceptors to start to restore the natural function of the so-called rods and cones, which are the two types of cells that are associated with the photoreceptors in the back of the eye. And the really amazing thing that we're seeing so far, Nicole, is that because early, particularly in the stage of disease, the photoreceptors become dormant because before they eventually die, we're actually getting restoration of vision. At least that's what we're observing in the phase 1 and phase 2 studies, where not only are we stabilizing the disease, but we're allowing subjects in these studies to start seeing 5 more letters, 10 more letters, sometimes even 15 or more letters of vision. So to put in perspective, Nicole, that's 3 lines on an eye chart. And if you've ever done an eye exam, imagine being able to see 3 more lines on an eye chart. So these are pretty significant improvements that we're talking about. Now, this needs to be proven in the context of a phase 3, and that's what we have ongoing right now, Nicole.
Absolutely. It's just incredible. Well, hope indeed. We'll see where this goes next. So, listeners also have heard a lot about geographic atrophy regarding Astellas' C5 inhibitor, for example. I was wondering, though, Lance, if you could tell us how a gene therapy approach seeks to bring hope also to geographic atrophy patients.
And geographic atrophy is one of those areas where, despite a lot of investment, a lot of research, we haven't made too much progress. But as you point out, Astellas in particular right now has one product called Ezervay, which targets something called complement, which has been implicated within the etiology, within the origin of this disease of geographic atrophy. Now, while that product has been demonstrated to slow the progression of disease, it does have significant what we call treatment burden. So in other words, these patients have to come back often every month or two to get another injection in the eye. And because it's stabilizing disease and not actually giving them a noticeable improvement, the patients aren't getting a lot of feedback. So it actually is doing good for the patients, but they're not getting a lot of real-time feedback. And so we're seeing a significant drop off in so-called compliance over time because the patients have to come back again every 1 or 2 months, get another injection, and then they come back and they say, Doc, yeah, this is great and all, but I'm not seeing any better. And so trying to convince the patients to keep coming back because the disease is being stabilized, but they're not getting that positive reinforcement, that positive feedback can be difficult. So what we're hoping is that with the product called BTX001, we're going to be able to get a protein within the vitreous that's going to target the complement, but it can be administered essentially in a one and done, where we could administer this intravitreally and then allow the complement, particularly C5, to be inhibited and therefore stabilize the disease and slow the progression, but not have the same treatment burden that you would have with something like Ezervay, something like is provided by Astellas.
And the Vista Phase 3 study, which I believe is fully enrolled, can you tell us more about that, Lance?
No, absolutely. That was perhaps the most exciting milestone of 2025, where we fully enrolled the pivotal VISTA study. And that study is the definitive study that's going to hopefully demonstrate the efficacy and the safety that's going to be required to bring this medicine and bring the data in front of worldwide regulators. And those data are expected towards the end of this year. So stay tuned for that. And I'd love to be back to talk to you, Nicole, after the readout of VISTA later this year.
Thank you. Yes, this stabilization versus actually seeing a restoration of vision is a fine dividing line indeed. So, talking about positivity, in January this year, Beacon, I believe, closed an oversubscribed Series C financing for over $75 million in order to accelerate commercial preparations for Larozova, as well as to advance and expand its pipeline. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about this financing round, Lance.
Absolutely. It's always great to have additional monies in the bank, and very thankful to add 2 new investors to the syndicate, including Goldman Sachs Life Sciences, as well as the Retinal Degeneration Fund, which is the venture philanthropy arm of the Foundation Fighting Blindness. In addition, we have participation from the existing syndicate. And what that money does it allows us to continue to go after the opportunities we have in front of us, including getting the data readout for VISTA, which is the phase 3 study that's going to be reading out towards the end of this year, continuing work on manufacturing, and then getting prepared to be able to launch this really important therapy for patients.
Thank you. So I have a final question for you today. Given everything we've been discussing, what's the future look like in the next, say, 5 years or 10 years, both in terms of Beacon's hopes and also the ocular disease landscape itself when it comes to innovation?
The field, the landscape of companies and of innovators that are going after, these very devastating diseases is crowded in a good way. And so we're going to see numerous successes, we're going to see numerous failures, but importantly, Nicole, we're going to learn from all of those experiences. And I would posit to say that in 5 years, 10 years time, there's going to be multiple gene therapies that are going to be available to help patients with these devastating diseases of the eye. We're cautiously optimistic that the next approved therapy will be Larazova for the treatment of X-linked retinitis pigmentosa. But the really nice thing, and I've worked across many different therapies, as I pointed out in the past, Nicole, a lot of us root for each other. The real enemy here is not the other companies that are working in this space by and large. It's really the diseases themselves. And so, I know I hope the best for many of my erstwhile competitors, and they often hope the best for me as well, because we really want to see that we can bring hope to many of these patients and their families that are suffering from these devastating diseases. And and the regulatory landscape will continue to evolve. And I hope that we can see more flexibility, particularly when it comes to some of these rare diseases. I do think we're going to see more flexibility, whether it's under the current administration or under future administrations. So I think that's going to help with innovation as well, because we can't make major investments if we don't know that we can have a reasonable regulatory path to get these improved. And so I do think we're going to see improvements within that area as well, Nicole.
Thank you for your insights today, Lance. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure to be here, Nicole. Thank you.
And that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your other podcasts from. Just search for pharmaphorum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.